Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into some really interconnected ideas. We're talking about demographic shifts, social change, and globalization.
Yeah.
And, these aren't just these abstract concepts that we're throwing around, they actually have, real impacts, especially for, future medical professionals like yourself.
Right.
Trying to navigate the complexities of patient care and public health.
Exactly.
So just think about, how sociology, economics, and public health kind of all converge in these areas. And to kind of help us walk through all of this, we've got Dr. Jordan Carter. She's a sociologist specializing in demography and social movements.
Thanks for having me.
So, this is pretty vital information for anyone, heading into the medical field.
Absolutely. I think understanding these broad societal forces is really essential for providing effective care to individuals and communities.
Yeah.
And, being able to anticipate some of the health challenges that are coming down the road.
Okay, so let's jump right in to kind of this foundational idea, I guess, of the demographic transition model. So can you kind of just lay out what this model describes?
Sure. So the demographic transition model is really a framework for understanding how populations change over time. And a lot of times this is in parallel with society's economic development. So, the model typically outlines 4, sometimes 5 stages. Stage 1 is characterized by high birth rates and high death rates, and this is really common in pre-industrial societies.
Okay.
Then stage 2, you start to see death rates falling.
Okay.
And this is due to improvements in things like, sanitation, nutrition, basic health care. But the birth rates remain high.
Yeah.
And so you get this significant population growth.
Wow, okay.
Stage 3, so now society is starting to industrialize, you get more urbanization, and birth rates start to decline.
Okay.
Because families might be opting to have fewer children. And finally, stage 4, you have both low birth rates and low death rates. And so this results in population stabilization, or a really slow growth. And some models propose a 5th stage where birth rates dip even below death rates, and that leads to a gradual population decline. But
yeah.
I think, what's interesting when we think about this model is to consider, stage 4, you've got this increasing proportion of elderly individuals, and that's not just about greater healthcare demand, but it's a fundamental shift towards managing chronic diseases.
Oh, okay.
Building elder care systems that can handle this. Maybe we're stretching some models that were initially designed for acute illnesses.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. It's not just, like you said, it's not just more care, it's a different kind of care.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's look at another theory here, the Malthusian Theory. This one has kind of a reputation for being, pretty pessimistic.
Yeah, it definitely carries some weight, some concern.
Yeah.
It was proposed by Thomas Malthus in the late 18th century. And the core idea is that population tends to grow exponentially. Think of it like a snowball rolling downhill, it just gets bigger and faster.
Yeah.
While the resources needed to sustain that population, so things like food production, tend to increase linearly, so at a much steadier, predictable pace.
Okay.
And so Malthus argued that this fundamental difference in growth rates would eventually lead to crises.
Oh, wow.
And he called these positive checks. It's kind of a weird way to put it, but it's things like famine, disease, and war that would kind of force the population back in line with the available resources. And while Malthus, of course, couldn't have predicted all the technological advances that we've made in agriculture and other fields, I think this underlying tension between population and resource availability is still relevant.
Right.
And I think this raises an important question for future medical professionals. How does this theory manifest in the 21st century? Maybe not just in food scarcity for some, but unequal access to clean water, affordable energy, even healthcare resources.
Yeah.
So it really highlights how scarcity can sometimes be socially constructed.
Yeah. No, that definitely reframes it in a really important way for our current context.
Right.
Okay, before we move on, let's check in with our listeners. Just a quick quiz question.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so which of the following theories predicts catastrophic outcomes due to population growth outpacing resources? Is it A, demographic transition theory, B, Malthusian theory, C, conflict theory, or D, modernization theory?
Take a second to think it over.
All right, and the answer is B, Malthusian theory.
Right. So the other theories offer slightly different lenses on societal change. So like the demographic transition model, that's really just describing a trend,
Right.
not necessarily a catastrophe.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's switch our focus to kind of some key population trends here. So, we often hear the terms fertility rate and birth rate used, sometimes interchangeably, but can you clarify the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So while both terms relate to births, they're actually measuring different aspects. So the fertility rate is a more specific measure. It's the average number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime.
Okay.
And this is based on current birth rates for women of the different age groups. So it gives us a sense of like the reproductive potential of a population. The crude birth rate, on the other hand, is a much broader measure.
Okay.
It's simply the total number of live births per 1,000 people in a given year.
Okay.
And while both are really important for understanding population growth, a seemingly small drop in the total fertility rate, like below the replacement level, which is around 2.1 children per woman, can have significant long-term consequences.
Oh.
And, that could lead to an aging population and potentially a shrinking workforce, which then directly impacts, the tax base that supports things like healthcare and Social Security.
Right. Yeah. No, that long-term impact is huge. And like you said, on societal structures.
Exactly.
Okay. What about how we measure mortality?
Okay, so similar to birth rates, we have the crude mortality rate. And it's just the total number of deaths per 1,000 people in a year. But to really get a more detailed picture, we also look at age-specific mortality rates.
All right.
So this tells us the number of deaths within a specific age group per 1,000 people in that group.
Okay.
And this is so valuable for public health. So for example, if you look at infant mortality rates, that can highlight really vulnerable populations in areas where interventions are most needed. And these mortality patterns, when combined with things like economic hardship or political instability, they can also contribute to migration flows as people are seeking safer and healthier environments. This data is really fundamental to epidemiological studies and identifying specific risk factors, which is all relevant to your future medical practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, they're not just numbers, they're indicators of societal well-being and maybe even potential crises.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about another major force that really shapes populations, and that's migration.
Right.
So we often hear about push and pull factors when it comes to migration. What are some of the key drivers here?
Yeah, so these concepts of push and pull are really central to understanding why people move. So push factors are, they're conditions that compel people to leave their homes. And this could be things like conflict, famine, lack of economic opportunities, or persecution.
Yeah.
And then you have pull factors, which are conditions in a new location that actually attract people. So, better job prospects, safety, maybe educational opportunities. And it's rare that, migration decisions are based on a single factor. It's usually combination of both.
Okay.
And these movements have profound effects. They reshape urban centers, they alter labor markets, and they place demands on healthcare systems, both in the sending and receiving countries.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Yeah, and it's this has direct implications for healthcare professionals, right?
Absolutely. So, in many healthcare settings, you're going to encounter patients from really diverse backgrounds.
Yeah.
Language barriers can be a really significant challenge.
Oh, for sure.
So that might require interpreters, being really culturally sensitive in how you communicate.
Right.
There might be different beliefs about health and, medical treatments, and also even just accessing, prior health records can be difficult for people who've moved, internationally. So, providing really effective and ethical care requires, this cultural competency and an awareness of these potential barriers.
Yeah, those are really important real-world considerations for, our listeners. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit here. Let's talk about social movements. So, what sparks people to come together and push for change?
Okay, well, one key idea here is relative deprivation, and this suggests that movements often arise not just from absolute poverty, but from a feeling of being worse off compared to others, or compared to what one believes they deserve. And this could even happen if their situation's actually improving. So think about the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about a lack of resources; it was a deep sense of injustice. compared to the opportunities afforded to others.
Right.
And so this feeling of, being left behind, even amid progress, can be a really powerful motivator.
Yeah.
And, I think this power of collective action that we've been discussing is increasingly playing out on a global stage.
Okay.
This is facilitated by globalization. We've got movements addressing things like climate change or human rights that are transcending national borders.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So it's about that, like, gap between like expectation and reality that really fuels that collective action.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do these movements typically organize themselves? Like, how do they actually, get together and make things happen?
Right. Well, they often start with, these informal networks of people who just share grievances.
Okay.
And then as they gain momentum, more formal organizations might develop, and they'll have specific goals and strategies. And these strategies could include things like protests, lobbying, using media to kind of raise awareness, and forming alliances with other groups. And it's rarely a straight path.
Yeah.
Movements can grow, they can decline, they can reemerge depending on, all sorts of social and political factors.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a very dynamic process, like you said, of action and reaction. Okay, let's do another quick check for our listeners here, another quiz question.
Okay, great.
Okay, so which of the following best explains why a social movement might arise among people who are better off than before but still feel excluded? A, absolute poverty. B, class conflict. C, relative deprivation. Or D, globalization.
So think about that core idea of feeling disadvantaged in comparison to others.
Okay, and the answer is C, relative deprivation.
That's right. So, absolute poverty is really about just lacking basic necessities.
Yeah.
And class conflict is more focused on these like broader societal power structures.
Okay.
And globalization is really just the interconnectedness of the world, which, can certainly influence social movements.
Yeah.
But it's not the direct explanation for this particular phenomenon.
Yeah, okay, awesome. All right, speaking of globalization, let's delve into that a little bit. So what are the main factors driving globalization?
Well, the acceleration of globalization is largely due to two things: advancements in technology, especially in communication and transportation,
Okay.
and the increasing economic interdependence between countries.
Okay.
So, the internet and affordable international travel have just like shrunk the world in so many ways.
Right.
And then economically, we're seeing more international trade agreements, and multinational corporations operating across borders.
Yeah.
And these forces have like fundamentally changed how nations and people interact.
Yeah, and this interconnectedness has like all these complex impacts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, on the one hand, it's facilitated like this incredible cultural exchange and the spread of ideas.
Yeah.
It's also created global labor markets.
Right.
But, it's also been linked to, civil unrest in some cases.
Yeah.
Growing economic inequality and, the faster spread of diseases across borders, as we
Right.
saw with COVID-19.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And, I think that really highlights the interconnectedness of global health. And even globalization has also led to the spread of dietary habits across cultures. So, for instance, increased consumption of processed foods globally.
Yeah.
That has implications for, rates of obesity and related chronic diseases, regardless of, geographical location.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. It really underscores like how interconnected our world is, like for better or for worse.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so finally, let's discuss urbanization and how cities evolve. So, what are like the typical stages of urbanization?
Well, urbanization is really the shift of population from rural to urban areas.
Okay.
And it often starts with industrialization, where cities kind of become these centers of economic activity,
Okay.
attracting huge numbers of people who are seeking work. And, this leads to really rapid growth, but also, challenges like overcrowding and pollution.
Right.
And, over time, as cities develop, we often see suburbanization,
Okay.
which is where, people and businesses move to the surrounding areas, maybe seeking more space or different living environments.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about like gentrification? How does that fit into this whole picture?
Right. So gentrification is a more recent and often debated aspect of urban change. And it involves wealthier individuals moving into lower income urban neighborhoods.
Okay.
And this can lead to investment, improvements in infrastructure.
Okay.
But it often causes, rents and property values to rise,
Yeah.
and potentially displacing long-term residents who can't afford to stay.
Right.
And, that has significant social and economic consequences for the people who are displaced, potentially increasing stress, disrupting social support networks, and impacting their access to healthcare. So, understanding these urban dynamics is so crucial for anyone going into healthcare.
Yeah.
Because cities are really major hubs for both, healthcare delivery and these diverse patient populations.
Yeah. No, it's a really, really complex mix of, potential benefits and some pretty significant risks for existing communities.
Yeah, exactly. And these shifts in urban populations directly impact the healthcare landscape.
Right. Okay, well, this has been, such a comprehensive overview. But I think just for our listeners, let's do a quick recap of, the key points here.
Okay, so to summarize, the demographic transition model explains population stabilization.
Right.
Malthusian Theory highlights the potential tension between population and resources. Fertility, mortality, and migration are really the core demographic forces shaping things.
Okay.
Migration involves, these push and pull factors.
Yeah.
Social movements often arise from relative deprivation and organize to create change.
Right.
Globalization connects the world
Yeah.
in complex ways with both benefits and risks.
Yeah.
And then urbanization involves stages of growth, suburbanization, and phenomena like gentrification.
Awesome. And you've emphasized, throughout this whole conversation, understanding these patterns is so important for, future medical professionals as you think about, the social determinants of health, the diverse communities you're going to be serving, and, just the broader healthcare landscape in general.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for, for taking the time to talk to us today and share your expertise. This was really, really great.
It was my pleasure. I think it's so vital for those entering medicine to grasp these societal forces.
Okay, so for our listeners, our next deep dive is going to explore behavioral change theories. So we're going to be talking about things like the health belief model and the theory of planned behavior. And I think, that really connects back to a lot of what we've talked about today, about social and demographic influences on health behaviors. So, keep that curiosity burning.
Exactly, and keep questioning how these broader trends really shape, individual lives and health.
Yeah. So a final thought, to leave you with, as you're envisioning your future medical careers, I really want you to consider the specific communities that you hope to serve. And, how might these demographic and social changes that we've discussed today, how might they uniquely impact those communities?
Yeah.
What specific challenges and opportunities might arise, in that context? And, reflecting on these questions now will be invaluable as you, continue to move forward in your journey. Okay, well, thanks again for listening to The Deep Dives. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.